When the slave ships had finished crossing the Middle Passage, the 4 to 6 week journey from Africa to the Caribbean, the slaves were very quickly washed down by their slave captains, and then they were taken to the slave auctions in the Caribbean. Now, this was the first stage in a process of slowly destroying the cultural heritage of the slaves, because families were quite often split up at this point, taken to different auctions. Slaves that had been captured as a group of villagers, for example, might at this stage have been broken up and put into different lots to be sold. The people who came to the slave auctions, the plantation owners, they were looking for healthy, fit workers to work on the plantations, and they weren't really concerned about much else. So they would quite often buy individual slaves, and this would mean that family units were very often split up. So slaves were taken away from their friends, from their communities, from their families. And the slave owner as well didn't want to worry about the strange names that had come from Africa. They wanted to give them familiar European sounding names. So the slave was given a new name, and legally would have to accept the surname as well of the slave owner. So Olaudah Equiano, for example, was initially given the name of Michael, and then when he was sold again to another owner, he was called Jacob, and then he was sold to another owner and was called Gustavus. So these slaves had their identities taken away from them, they had their names taken away from them. And then they were taken to the plantations by their new owners. This might be in the Caribbean, on the Caribbean islands. Some were taken to North America, and some were taken to South America. So whole communities were completely split up, never to see each other again. The work that the slaves had to do was working on these large plantations. Now, plantations are these large farms that sell a cash crop. So these are crops that you're not growing to nourish people. They're crops you're going to sell to make money. So crops, for example, like tobacco, coffee, cotton, and also sugar. And here we have an illustration from slaves working on a sugar palm plantation, doing the hard, grueling work in the hot Caribbean sun of harvesting the sugar cane. And as you can see, men and women were expected to do the hard physical labour. There was no division in the sexes between who was going to do this hard work. Children as well were expected to work on the fields, and if they weren't strong enough or tall enough to be useful in the harvest, they're expected to maybe go in and out and weed to help collect up the sugar cane. So they were put to work as well. Pregnant women were expected to continue working right up to the point that they gave birth, and after the birth, that they should get back to work as soon as possible, carrying the newborn infant, who would then, as soon as they can physically help, they would be made to help. And work was from sunrise to sunset. Slaves would get a break to have breakfast, and a break to have lunch. But they were working all day, 6 days a week, from 6 in the morning till 6 at night. So hard, long, grueling hours, with no pay, of course, because they were slaves. Now, some slaves could get slightly better food rations and maybe slightly better lodgings by becoming an overseer. So these would be the slaves who carried the whip, who would beat the other slaves were they not working hard enough. So once the sugar cane had been brought in by the slaves, it would then be taken to the mill to be crushed down. And here again you see the slaves doing the back-breaking labour of carrying the sugar cane into the mill, and then the sugar cane being milled down. And again, the illustration shows that men and women shared this hard labour. And once the sugarcane had been ground down in the mill, it was then taken to the boiling house. Now, this is where the sugar would be boiled out of the crushed sugarcane and before it was put into the beds to finally refine into sugar. And this was hot, dangerous work. There are plenty of accounts of slaves falling into the boiling vats and burning to death. There's no health and safety equipment at all. And you can imagine that this was very hot, grueling work as well. Now, in the past few illustrations, you might have noted that the slaves are actually looking quite well dressed. There are no slaves being beaten. The white plantation owners seem to be very smart and well dressed, and in this illustration, is even chatting to a slave. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong impression of slavery, because the artist that drew these pictures, did visit a slave plantation in the Caribbean in the 1700s, but he was paid to do these drawings by the plantation owner themselves. The plantation owner actually wanted these illustrations to hang on his very well-to-do home back in England. So he wanted to show off the extent of his wealth by how many slaves he owned, which might explain why this is a rather cleaned up version of slave life. So the work that slaves did was very hard, grueling work, incredibly long hours, from when you were born until when you dropped dead in the fields. And the average life expectancy of a slave after getting off a boat in the Middle Passage was about 8 years. So you can get some idea of how hard slaves were worked. Now, this photograph was taken in the middle of towards the end of the 19th century, and it shows a plantation owner's house. And as you can see in this photograph, there are some slaves that would actually attend to the plantation owner and their family, and they would get to live in the plantation owner's house, in the servants' quarters, of course. Now, so slaves were used as maids. Slave children were quite often used as playmates for the plantation owners' children. They could be butlers, and this could mean for slaves that you had slightly better living conditions. The quality of your food might be slightly better because you could have the leftovers which the plantation owners' families left. But it would depend on the nature and the personality of the slave owner, of the plantation owner and their family, as to what your life was like. Many of the slaves that worked at the plantation owner's house had to endure sexual harassment, had to endure the mood swings and the violence of the plantation owner. So life could be incredibly traumatic, even if you got one of the soft jobs of working in the plantation owner's house. Now, the life of a slave could be absolutely horrific. Must remember that if you're a slave, you are the property of the plantation owner. The plantation owner can legally do with you what they like. Now, a plantation owner would have paid good money for you as a slave. They want you to work to make them money, say to harvest sugar so they can sell the sugar to make money. So slave owners wouldn't set out to kill slaves or maim them so they couldn't work, but many slave owners did use horrific and very brutal forms of punishment in order to force slaves to comply to rules, to force them to work. And here's a photograph taken in the late 1800s, and we can see a slave here who has the healed scars on his back of when he was whipped as a slave. So we can imagine when these scars were fresh, how horrific the injuries must have been. slaves were frequently whipped on the back until their flesh was literally hanging off their back. And this was used as a punishment quite often for slaves that ran away and were caught again, and they were publicly whipped as a deterrent to other slaves to not try the same sort of thing. But slaves could be whipped like this for simply not working hard enough in the fields. And also you need to remember that because there wouldn't have been any rules, as you know, in schools. If you do something wrong, you might get detention. If you don't do your homework, you might get detention. There's a clear connection between a rule and a punishment. This wouldn't have been the case on plantations at all. A slave could have been whipped like this for no reason whatsoever than just the slave owner didn't like them and was in a bad mood. So there were some really horrific punishments that were meted out to slaves. Beyond whipping, there were the irons as well. So these were punishment devices made from iron, which were frequently used by plantation owners. You can see the collars with spikes on. Quite often these spikes would be a meter, sometimes 2 meters long. And if you can imagine trying to work in the hot fields with this iron on, which would rub at your skin and tear the skin off because of the spikes, you couldn't lie down, you couldn't sleep. So it's a really horrific form of punishment. The face mask was put on to stop you from eating. But again, you'll be expected to work in the hot fields with this on, and you can see the spikes, which would be placed around the ankles to prevent you from walking properly. And if you did need to walk, then the spikes would dig into your other leg. So again, really horrific forms of punishment. And again, these would be used for runaway slaves or for any sort of act of disobedience, or again, just on the whim of the plantation owner, if they just felt like punishing you. There was also branding as well. So this was taking some letters that had been crafted in iron and then heating that iron up and then placing that hot iron onto the skin, and so it would leave it a burn mark, and that burn mark would be some letters, quite often the initials of the slave owner. Edward Colston, for example, had his slaves branded with the initials of his trading company across their chest. So this was done as a matter of course. Of course, the brand could become infected, and many slaves did die of the infection of the branding. But again, it was incredibly painful thing that happened as a matter of course to slaves. If you were a runaway, you were very often branded on your face to make sure that if you ran away, then another slave owner caught you, it would be clear who to return the slaves to. So branding was another common brutal thing that happened during slavery. But I think it's important that that we don't paint slaves as victims, that their lives weren't all misery and hardship. Slaves held on really tightly to their African traditions. So even though they're quite often split up from their families and their fellow countrymen, that they still retained a lot of the traditions and songs and dances of the countries that they came from. So slaves didn't have to work on Sundays. It was a day of religious observance. And slaves quite often use these days as days of release from an escape from the hardship of their lives, and they're quite often days for dancing and music and celebration. And through this, they kept their own cultures alive. And they also did this through singing as they worked as well. And this this continuation of African culture were the roots of blues music, were the roots of jazz music, of R&B, of hip hop, and all and the music that dominates the music charts of the world today. Also, with their free time on Sundays, many slaves also grew their own produce in little plots of land. They would make things, and quite often slaves would take these produce which they grew themselves or made themselves to market on Sunday to sell. So some slaves could make a little bit of money privately, and a very tiny number of slaves actually managed to store up enough money through this enterprise to buy their own freedom from kind plantation owners. Of course, it was completely at the discretion of a plantation owner whether they'd allow you to buy your freedom, but a few slaves, such as Olaudah Equiano, were able to do this. But being a slave, remember, means that you belong to somebody else, and so many slaves throughout the centuries were treated incredibly brutally. And remember, the slave couldn't choose their master. It was a matter of chance whether you had a kind master who, in a plantation where there wasn't that much brutal punishment, or whether you had a harsh master, was completely left to chance. And even if you had the kindest master, you were still their possession. You still had no personal freedoms. And your children and your grandchildren, you knew, would be born into slavery as well. And this was the way of life for an estimated 11 million slaves that were taken from the continent of Africa and brought to the Americas. And it's the way of life not only for those 11 million slaves, but for their descendants for several hundred years, until slavery was slowly abolished in the 19th century.